The second state witness is on the stand at the Meyiwa Murder Trial, but at the start of court proceedings, the defense for accused 1 to 4 raised concerns about Sergeant Patrick Mlungisi Mthethwa. Defense lawyer Titi Tobane alleged that Mthethwa and his colleague were following Sergeant Thabo Musia's testimony on a cell phone outside the courtroom while they were waiting to be called as witnesses. Musia concluded his testimony yesterday. 5 men are on trial for the murder of the goalkeeper in the High Court in Pretoria. Meyiwa was shot and killed during an alleged robbery at the home of his girlfriend Kelly Khumalo in Vosloorus in 2014. Meyiwa received heavy criticism from the defense for allegedly failing to handle the crime scene as an expert. Speaking to journalists outside the court after his testimony, he conceded that the crime scene was challenging for him. For more, we cross to SABC News senior reporter Chriselda Lewis. Chriselda, perhaps you can give us some perspective on the proceedings so far.
Well, that's right. Sergeant Mthethwa says that they received over the police radio a call about the shooting at about 20:53 on that night that Senzo Meyiwa was killed. They say they took a bit between 8 and 10 minutes in order to arrive at the scene. And when they got there, they found a man who described himself as an uncle to the owner of the house. So what we can deduce from that this would be the brother of Gladness Khumalo, who is the owner of the house where Senzo Meyiwa was killed. So what Sergeant Mthethwa says is that it was the uncle who then had opened the house for them. They stayed there very briefly after they were informed by Temba that the person had been shot and had been taken to hospital. He also described that they then left and got to the hospital. And once they arrived there, there was a lady who had introduced herself as Ma Khumalo, which we now understand to be Gladness Khumalo, who is the mother of Kelly Khumalo. And what he essentially said was that before they're, of course, gone to the hospital, what they did briefly was to go inside the house, and he described to us what it is that they found inside. Let's take a listen.
Ukhona inaqaphela yini nkathi ningena ngaphakathi endlini?
Hey, nazo nokubheka kwami nje masingena endlini mangikhumbula kahle. Kwakungakubheka ukuthi phela khona okwenzakele lapha ngoba naye akazi noma kwenzakele phakathi noma ngaphandle wayengakhuluma into esile. Into engayibona nje hamba amakani amabili. Amakani elantingana ini otshwala mangaphosisi. Kunye.
Because there was nothing that because he didn't know, he didn't know as to whether the incident occurred inside the house or outside the house. And from what we could see inside the house, one couldn't tell whether something had happened there. If I'm not mistaken, I think I just only saw 2 bottles of liquor there, if I'm not making a mistake.
And this was on the first instance when he arrived at the house. He says then, after they'd briefly gone inside the house, and that's what he saw, when he came outside, he had seen quite a number of people who had been standing outside who indicated that there were 2 individuals who had ran towards the nearby park. And Mthethwa says when they went to the park, they did not find anything, and that's when they'd gone to the hospital. Let's take a listen to what he said about what he then said were neighbors who told him that they'd seen some individuals run towards the park.
Ngaphambi kosesiphuma endlini kwasekugcwele nomakhelwane lapha ngoba bathi aza abantu babaleke baphuma ngapha ngase park.
Okay, bambe lapha bambe. When we went out of the house, now outside there was already a lot of people, the neighbors, and they were alleging that the people ran towards the park.
Which people?
Bathi abantu babaleke baye ngase park baphi abantu
shothi ngendlela babechaza ngayo bathi kunabantu abawu2 abababone bebaleka beshona ngapha ngase park.
The manner in which they were describing it, my lord, they were saying that they saw 2 people that were running and those people ran towards the park.
All right, so Mthethwa says after they had left the scene, that was the very first time, they'd gone to the hospital, and on arrival there, there was a BMW, which we now understand to be the BMW which is shown in one of the exhibits, which is believed to have been driven by Kelly Khumalo. And when he arrived at the hospital, he saw two occupants, two ladies inside, and the occupant on the passenger side had opened the window and asked him whether he was coming to the hospital. And afterwards, he had gone inside. When he arrived there, he met Uma Khumalo, who we understand to be Gladness Khumalo. And at some point, he had spoken to a nurse who had taken him to where Senzo Meyiwa was lying. He describes Meyiwa as lying on the bed, and also pointed inside court to where he had been shot. He had pointed towards this direction inside this court. He says then afterwards, Khumalo had agreed to take them back to the scene, and when they arrived there, it was the uncle who then opened the house for them. That's where he found the bullet projectile, a hat also. He says he was also shown by Khumalo a hat which he described to be belonging to one of the people who are alleged to have been behind what took place in the house at that night. But let's just take a listen to how he described what he found when the nurse had taken him inside the hospital to where Senzo Meyiwa's body was lying.
Ngabona ukuthi wayene ngicabanga kwakune bullet hole.
Sicela usukume uzokwazi uthatha kubona wenda ukhomba kuyona.
Angazi noma ngikhomba kahle kodwa nje wayene somewhere.
I don't know whether I'm pointing precisely, my lord, but I think it was a bullet hole somewhere here.
All right, you would also recall that during the testimony of the forensic detective Thabo Mosia, he had indicated that when he arrived at the scene, it was Brigadier Ndlovu who had basically showed him where to take photographs and exhibits as well. But what we're hearing now from Mthethwa is that he also indicates that the photographer had arrived at the scene and had introduced himself as Constable Mosia. He was then speaking to Captain Zwane, and then the task team arrived. So when he was asked about this task team, he said that the person that he knew from the task team was Brigadier Ndlovu. Now what we're trying to understand now is that you recall Mosia had indicated that when he arrived at the scene, he had found Brigadier Ndlovu there, and Brigadier Ndlovu is the one who told him where to take photographs on the scene and showed him basically where this incident is believed to have taken place. But what we're hearing now from Mthethwa is that the photographer who arrived and introduced himself was Constable Mosia. He was speaking to a Captain Zwane, and then the task team arrived. Part of that task team, we understand from Mthethwa, in that, I quote, he says, the person I knew from that task team was a Brigadier Ndlovu. So this is in stark contradiction to what we've heard in terms of Mosia indicating that he arrived at the scene, and when he arrived there, it was Brigadier Ndlovu who had basically shown him where to take photographs. What we're hearing from Mthethwa now was that Mosia arrived, who was the photographer who introduced himself, and then it was the task team that arrived at a later stage, and Mthethwa says who he noticed from that task team was this Brigadier Ndlovu. So we're expecting when we return after lunch was that we're also hearing currently, just before we went to lunch from Titi Tobane, who basically accuses Mthethwa of being part of the contamination of the scene or some sort of dereliction of duty, in the instance that when he went to the scene the first time and found the man who described himself as the uncle in that house, that quickly rushed to the hospital and had not cordoned off the scene. A bit of an exchange inside court before we went to lunch, in that Titi Tobane is asking him why he did not cordon off the scene in the first instance, and that he had opened the door for some kind of contamination to take place, and that his response, Mthethwa's response, was that he hadn't known exactly what had happened there, and that's the reason why they'd left the scene and gone to the hospital. So we're expecting quite a lot more cross-examination. Once Titi Tobane is done, we indicated He's got about 5 more questions that he will pose to this current witness, and then Advocate Zandile Mshololo will start with her cross-examination. But lots of indications. What is certainly coming to light now is what possibly happened. You would recall that it was the forensic detective Thabo Musia who indicated that he'd been called to the scene 4 hours after the incident had taken place. So we're really trying to getting to understand inside this court now what exactly happened in those 4 hours before Musia had arrived. And some of the contradictions, of course, that are now arriving is that Tetwa is indicating that Musia had arrived first, and then it was Brigadier Ndlovu who was part of that task team who arrived at a later stage. Some of the contradictions that we're already picking up.